بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to The Conviction Project. I am your host, Madhaj Rana, and I'm here with my friend, the Imam Farhan Iqbal. Farhan, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Farhan, recently in news, this Me Too movement has caught a lot of attention of everyone. A lot of people have been coming out after some time and now coming forward with accusations of assault, accusation of injustice towards them. And, this really what it brings to attention is how flawed our societal structure is, I believe. I believe that, in a society where promiscuity is the norm, where modesty, sexual virginity are things of the past, this, I think, is a byproduct of our society and our cultural norms. Because we have come so far from traditional norms, for example, premarital sex is now the norm, whereas before people used to wait until they were married and then continue on their lives. Now the norm is completely different. And I think this is a byproduct of it. And many people, such as this Me Too movement, I suppose, or an extreme version of this Me Too movement, is they like to point fingers at who's right, who's wrong. It's the men's fault. No, it's the woman's fault. It's the men's fault. And I think that Islam presents a picture where it's the structure. The structure needs to change. The culture needs to change. The understanding of gender roles and sexuality needs to change. And I think we've talked about this a lot many times before, but I think one aspect that we haven't talked about, and I think this can lead into different sections on legal matters, is what is sort of, I guess, the legal stance on what to do when someone is accused or someone is told that they have done some sort of adultery or fornication. What's the legal stance from an Islamic perspective?
Yeah, I'll get to the legal question. When you were speaking, I actually was reminded of a number of things. First of all, I was thinking that 2 months ago when we talked about sexual abuse and the Islamic response to it, this news was actually pretty relatively new, right? And I actually did not think that it would grow so big, and now I think it has grown so much, and in fact, it has grown so much that people have started actually criticizing it. Just recently, I came across some news in France about some celebrities there actually speaking against this whole movement, and they're saying that, the promiscuity has become somewhat normalized, and in that sense, should we be so aggressive about the morality surrounding it? And in fact, I think that they said that it's okay for men to hit on women, and this is something that should be acceptable. And so there's this tussle, I think, between, I would say, from an Islamic perspective, between morality and immorality. There's this tussle that we see. And I think part of it is the way our society is structured. Our culture has grown into this. A couple of years ago, I read some Pew research on the fact that men and women actually get married a lot later than they used to. So compared to the 1960s, a lot more people are marrying into the late 20s or early 30s, right? So, waiting this long for marriage, obviously we have some natural tendencies, and we're going to, fool around before marriage. And like you said, it has become somewhat normal. So what is the Islamic angle to this? We will talk about it in this episode, but you were specifically asking about legal matters, right?
Yes, exactly. So legal matters on what to do when an accusation happens.
Well, let me put it more bluntly as compared to you have asked me a very easy version of the question. A more blunt question would be that, say, in Pakistan, a girl gets raped, and the Sharia court, right? There's a Sharia court in Pakistan, by the way, a so-called. We do not endorse it at all. We do not agree with their practices at all. It is the strangest court in the world, and if a girl gets raped and she reports it to that court, they will actually ask her to produce 4 witnesses.
Really?
Right? Yeah, and instead of finding some sort of justice, she ends up becoming trapped because in that conservative society, it's dishonorable to talk about these things. It's about family honor. It's about a lot of things. And if, despite all those things, she actually goes up to the court and seeks justice, this is how they're going to respond, which is ridiculous, really. I mean, a rape cannot be something that happens in front of 4 witnesses and none of those witnesses do anything about it. It's ridiculous. So when it comes to legal matters, when it comes to things like rape, this thing happened at the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as well. This is not something that is happening in the modern world. This happened at that time as well, and there was no demand for witnesses even in those cases. And just as we were preparing for this podcast, we were just talking about the story of Hazrat Aisha radiallahu anha, and how even she was accused at one point falsely. And the Quran talks about it in Surah Nur. If you read verses 18, 19, 20, and then it goes, the whole subject matter is there. And then in verse number 24, it says, those who accuse chaste, unwary, believing women are cursed in this world and the hereafter. So the Quran talks about this, and the Quran talks about accusing others. So there are both sides to this story. If you accuse a chaste woman of doing something wrong, that is also really a gross sin in Islam, and vice versa, right? Vice versa. And this is what we are seeing in our society nowadays, and it's a challenge, I think.
And, I was reading this essay by Margaret Atwood, a Canadian author who wrote, something about I'm a bad feminist, something along those lines. But in it, she talked about the Salem witchcraft or witch trials, which basically was that if you accuse someone, they're guilty. And more or less, I think this is what's happening in our society now too, where if someone is accused, they're automatically guilty. In fact, what used to be innocent until proven guilty is now guilty until proven innocent. And even then, your reputation is tarnished more or less.
Do you think that could be something, I mean, being a psychologist, do you think that could be something that is a product of the kind of culture we have created around ourselves, the kind of movie culture that is promoted, right? The one of the greatest, I would say, one of the people very important in Hollywood was accused of this, and the kind of movies he was producing. And we talked about this, I think, in one of the podcasts. I referenced a Washington Post article where they talked about how the same person who has been accused by so many different women produced movies. And in those movies, the same kind of culture was promoted. And don't you think that's a product of this culture that this is happening?
I think that it's sort of like a pendulum. Things happen in response to other things, and then they go into an extreme, and then something happens again, and they go into extreme. If you look at Western history has a very, I think, deep and dark history with treating women unjustly. Women weren't allowed to work, women weren't allowed to vote, and in response to that, it went to another extreme. And now we are living kind of in that other extreme. And I think that everything that's happening right now is a product of a lot of repression. And the saying, if I'm correct, is if a woman is like a rib bone, which is curved, and if you straighten it and you break it, it can cause a lot of problems. So, and I believe you can correct me on that. I think I completely butchered that reference. But I think that's what ends up happening, is that when you take something and you bend it so much that it breaks, this is the result of that.
Yeah, I think it's a very beautiful reference. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually talked about how women's nature is different, right? He's trying to teach men that just as a curvature of a rib bone is there to protect the body against harm. In the same way, women are that protectors of the society, and if you try to change them forcefully, it breaks and it causes havoc in the society. And he's trying to, I think, speak against misogyny in this reference. Unfortunately, the same reference is used by certain extremists or literalists to go the other way, when in fact this is a very beautiful reference to the nature of women and how it's actually discouraging misogyny. And I think we're talking about a lot of different things here today, but coming back to the issue when it comes to accusations. So what is the Islamic point of view? What do you think?
I think that when it comes to accusations, a thorough investigation is necessary. I think Islam stands for just principles, and Islam stands for justice. And if justice can't be reached in any way, then that is kind of like the cornerstone of any, I think, Islamic instruction, legal or elsewise.
Exactly. The Prophet Muhammad was very clear. He said, "Laysa al-khabru kal-mu'ayna," which means that a piece of news any piece of news, any hearsay is nothing like something that has evidence, something that you have observed. So basically, a piece of news with supporting evidence, that's the one you should trust, and not something that is just a random accusation. Something happened 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and somebody's just talking about it. I can understand that in some cases there's abuse and there's assault, and these are things that cause shame, and it's difficult for some people to talk about it. That's understandable, but nevertheless, we should treat all such accusations with caution, because in some cases they may not be entirely true. And just a recent episode of that actually happened just a couple of days ago, when a girl said something about being assaulted, and the police later on came out and said this never happened. This is something that happened in Toronto, and a lot of people got onto it. Our prime minister was talking about it, our politicians were talking about it, a lot of people, even internationally, and 2 days later you come to realize that this wasn't even true. So we have to be careful. We have to be very careful. Like the Quran says, back to that verse that I just quoted earlier, those who accuse chaste women are cursed in this world and the hereafter. So this accusation is a very gross sin in the eyes of Islam, which is not true. The one that is not true, false accusation, is a very gross sin.
And, that example that you presented of the Toronto police, I think is exactly what an Islamic system would promote as well. It's that, an accusation comes, you take it very seriously, and you do a thorough investigation, and you produce the results based on the evidence that you have gathered.
Right. You have to have the evidence. You have to carefully analyze it before you can come to a conclusion about it. And I think there are certain topics. We're coming to the end of this podcast, but there are certain topics that are related to this, and we need to cover those. And I think in the next episode we can talk about domestic abuse as well, right? And how the Islamic perspective. There's so many questions people have about this. In fact, one of the most common questions I get from non-Muslims is about domestic abuse and what is the Islamic perspective on this, and we can talk about it probably in the next episode.
And, many people have also approached me and told me, well, does Islam allow beating your wife? And I guess if you want to know the answer to that question, then you will tune in next week with us. And, if you have any more doubts related to, what's going on currently, maybe an internal struggle that you are facing, feel free to reach out to us at TheConvictionProject@gmail.com. And if you'd like to listen to any of our previous episodes, you can also visit us at www.TheConvictionProject.com, or our new YouTube channel on The Conviction Project. If you type that in on YouTube, it should come up as well. And this episode as well will also be available on YouTube. Once again, this is the Conviction Project, where we leave you with no doubts about Islam.
الحق من ربك فلا تكونن من الممترين.
It is the truth from thy Lord. Be not therefore of those who doubt.